Hey guys, Andrey is here, and in this video we're going to start the discussion on Ruy Lopez, focusing on the exchange variation. It goes like e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5. Here black plays a6, immediately attacking the bishop, and instead of going away somewhere, bishop captures the knight on c6. So it may look a bit counterintuitive, because white actually doesn't win a pawn on a5. We'll understand why. Instead, exchanging the bishop for the knight. And in the introductory video, I mentioned that this bishop is actually very important. So is it just a positional mistake? Well, not really. Let's have a look. Black usually recaptures with the d7 pawn on c6. And that is the result of the operation. You may notice there's doubled pawns, which is a positional drawback, and it is a long-term drawback. So black cannot really change the situation unless white allows that. So what does it mean? It means that at some point when the pawn structure changes, normally white tries to do that with the help of d4 a bit later, and the pawns e5 and d4 are exchanged. So let's just imagine this situation. White gets a typical advantage on the king side. It is a pawn majority, so 4 against 3. Formally, black also has 4 against 3 on the queen side, but the difference is clear, I guess. So with this pawn formation, it's pretty hard to create a passer, while white has no problems with that stuff. That's why white is so happy to play the endgame here, because exactly in the endgame, it will be possible to try to convert this advantage. So what is the compensation for this drawback for black? Well, obviously pair of bishops. So any open position will be quite beneficial for black. So white has to be very careful with pushing pawns on the king side here, because it may create additional possibilities for these powerful bishops. So advantages and disadvantages, and everything depends, of course, on your strength. So if you're a good endgame player, you may consider this line for white. And if you play this with black pieces, of course, you have to know what to do here, because it may be quite tricky. So you're maybe wondering what is going on with the pawn e5, because at first glance it is just hanging. The problem for white here is that after knight takes e5, e4 is also hanging, and the knight is not so well supported here, so black may regain the pawn immediately by putting the queen on d4, attacking both the knight and the pawn. And white doesn't have a chance to save both. So, for example, after knight goes away somewhere, let's say on f3, black simply captures on e4 with check. It's another annoying thing here, because white doesn't want to put the king on f1 or something, so queen e2 is forced. Here is the exchange of queens, but in this situation, as you may notice, white no longer has a majority. So basically white has no compensation for black's pair of bishops, and this endgame is quite good for black. After playing something like bishop f5, castling, and completing the development of the king side, black should be at least slightly better. So pawn on e5 is not hanging, which means if white wants to attack it, he has to do something in addition. I mean, to either protect e4 somehow or make it impossible for black to capture it later on. So one of the most natural moves here is castling, and this is the main line. So after castling, e5 is actually hanging, because now if black makes any move, let's say h6, just to show you the idea, white can actually capture on e5, because in the same line after queen d4, knight f3, queen e4 is impossible because of rook to e1, and white wins the queen. So e5 is hanging, which means black has to protect it somehow, and there are plenty of different possibilities to do that. So there are different methods even. We may protect it directly. We may pin the knight f3 with the bishop g4 move. We may also put one of the minor pieces on the e-file so that rook e1 will be not so efficient anymore. So in this position, if you check the database, you may find literally any moves like bishop e7, closing the e-file, bishop to e6, closing the e-file, even knight to e7, closing the e-file so that it will be possible tactically to play queen d4 and queen e4 after that. As well as some more natural continuations directly protecting the pawn, like queen f6, queen d6, queen e7 probably, f6 with the pawn, and the spin bishop to g4. So two most popular continuations here are exactly f6 with the pawn and bishop to g4. So let's start with the bishop g4. It looks more active and at first glance doesn't really weaken anything. The problem with the bishop g4 here, as well as anywhere in a similar situation, is that white can immediately attack this bishop. So black doesn't want to take on f3, obviously, because in that case, although position is not lost, but positionally it is much worse than before. Why? Because there is still this drawback with double pawns, but there is no compensation anymore. So black no longer has pair of bishops. So bishop captures f3 is not correct. But what to do then? It feels like if bishop goes away, then there will be g4 and then e5 will drop. So that line is also possible, but it's probably not the main direction. So it's quite tricky, but if white plays correctly, there will be just an extra pawn. Instead, black tries something really cool. It is h5, protecting the bishop with a pawn. So now, white may wonder why not to capture the bishop. It's quite simple. So if pawn takes on g4, then pawn takes on g4, and h-file becomes open. If the knight moves somewhere, for example, captures the pawn on e5, then queen simply jumps to h4, creating a threat of a checkmate on h1. And white doesn't have a satisfactory defense here. For instance, if white plays like f4 trying to run away through f2 square, black has simple g3 move prior to moving the queen to h1. So checkmate is inevitable here. And that's the problem with this. And if white decides, for example, to keep the knight on f3 and to play something else, for example, d3 move, just preparing the development of the pieces, black simply captures the knight after natural queen takes f3. Queen anyway goes to h4, and the only way to prevent a checkmate is to play queen to h3. There are different options for black, but the easiest is just to play queen takes h3, g takes h3, and rook takes h3, having the extra pawn in the endgame. So black is definitely better here. This means taking the bishop on g4 is impossible, and white has to prepare this. And there are different methods to do that. Some of them are better than the others. For instance, if white for some reason decides to play something like c3 here, in this position, just preparing a d4 move, black may blockade the d2 with the help of queen to d3 move. So now it's really hard for white to continue the development, and pawn takes g4 is still not necessarily that great. So for example, takes, although it no longer loses because the queen is far away from the h-file, but it gives black a very simple draw. For example, after knight takes e5, there is a surprising move bishop to d6, attacking it, and if knight captures the queen, there is a perpetual after bishop to h2. So king is forced to h1, and now anything like bishop g3, king g1, bishop h2, just a quick draw. So if white wants to fight for something more than a draw, it's not an option. I mean this c3 line. So let's get back to the situation after h5. So in this position, white should most likely play just d3, preparing the development of the queen side pieces. The idea is to support the knight from d2, and another idea is to put the bishop on e3, so both are playable, both are possible. Black usually tries to exert additional pressure on the knight with the help of queen to f6. And, well, here white has two options. The one is bishop e3, another one is knight to d2. Bishop to e3 looks pretty strange because it allows black to take on f3, damaging the pawn structure. But this move is not so simple, in fact. To be completely honest, I played this bishop e3 myself a lot because it leads to, well, Unusual endgame. All right, so captures on f3, obviously white captures with the queen because white cannot justify this damaged pawn structure in the middle game, but in the endgame it's not so critical. So queen takes f3 now, g takes f3, and we can see that, well, black no longer has pair of bishops, but this drawback, I mean this doubled pawns, is compensated by white's doubled pawns and damaged pawn structure on the king side in general. So what are the plans here? Well, there are different possibilities. Normally white tries to play f4, so black's next move is bishop d6 just to prevent it. Then white tries to do different things. I mean, f4 is hardly ever possible after bishop to d6, but after knight d2, white tries to play something like knight c4, maybe to capture the bishop and then play f4, opening the position. Another possible plan for white here is to bring the rook to b1, which looks again very strange, but then something like b4, a4, and sort of b5 attack starts, trying to create some new possibilities for the rook, this or that one, maybe create some weaknesses, and so on. King is usually centralized after that. Black is trying to complete a development to build something like this structure, just to fix all these weaknesses, and then maybe to bring the knight to h4 to attack f3, maybe to f4. Another possibility is to play f5 at some point, also a possibility, then open the f-file and try to get to opponent's weaknesses. So I would say this position is pretty balanced. So it's an interesting endgame, but it's nothing special. It's all about just playing chess. Another option for white is to protect the knight with the knight immediately without playing bishop to e3. So in this position, instead of giving black a chance to damage the pawn structure, knight goes to d2 immediately. And this means whenever black captures on f3, white recaptures with the knight and the pawn structure remains intact. In this position, black usually continues with the knight to e7 move, preparing the maneuver of the knight towards the king, so through g6 to probably h4 or f4, exerting additional pressure on kingside pawns. Here, white may prepare the capture on g4, so rook e1 is the first stage of the preparation. So after rook e1, you may notice that king has the square f1 to run away. So it's really close to capturing the bishop. Now black has to be very careful. Still though, in this position, it's possible to ignore the threat and play knight to g6, because if white captures the bishop here, h takes g4, h takes g4, it is still impossible to escape the worst scenario. So the natural move here is to play knight to h2. By the way, another idea behind rook to e1 is to create this square for another knight to actually close the h-file for black's pieces. The problem though is that bishop goes to c5, and now white doesn't have a satisfactory defense of the f2 pawn. So if knight captures on g4, there is always queen h4, and it's over. If queen goes somewhere to e2, there is a resource knight to f4. If king tries to run away a bit later through f1, there is also knight to f4 preventing that. This is very bad position for white. Instead, white tries an interesting trick based exactly on what black is going to do in case of h takes g4. So it is d4 move. So what's the point? White just starts active operations in the center, so it's not bad in a positional sense. But additionally, white is trying to close the diagonal a7, g1 for the bishop. So after e captures d4, white starts with the e5, also a very useful move to create additional squares for the knight, additional space for other pieces. And now, for example, if queen goes to f4, white can capture on g4 already. So after hg4, hg4, there is an intermediate move, knight to e4, attacking the queen. And after queen to f5, knight also goes to g3, covering h1 square. So as we can see, there is no attack anymore. And after queen goes away and knight goes to h2, there is simply the extra minor piece for white. So it doesn't work. Another potential option is to move the queen to f5 after e5. Let's also have a look at that. So in this position, after e5, black puts the queen on f5. But here, since diagonal is closed, white is ready to take the bishop. So h takes g4, h takes g4, then knight goes to h2. Let's say queen goes to h5, knight goes to f1. As you can see, there is no resource like bishop to c5. So white is safe here. Of course, black still has some tricks, but in general, everything is good and white simply has extra minor piece. So after playing d4, white is ready to take the bishop. That's the point. It means that after d4, black cannot take on d4 and has to do something else. Again, it will be just pathetic to go away with the bishop somewhere. It will be just a loss of time. It will be not correct to take on f3, just losing the pair of bishops. So the normal move here is knight to f4. The point is that knight gets closer to the king, and now queen has also h6 square to join the rook in the attack against the king. So now, after taking on g4, white has a choice, obviously, but it's not so wide, because it will be extremely dangerous to, for example, go away with the knight. Black's attack with this knight on f4 should be just decisive. So instead, white tries something like g3. This is a very interesting move to remember. It's a typical trick to diffuse the pressure. So after this move, white is ready at some point just to play knight to h4, let's say, to close the h-file. And after g takes f3, queen joins the defense. So queen captures on f3, and it already covers the h1 square. So here, after something like knight to e6, because knight has to go away, white can capture on e5, and after queen takes e5, play something like knight to b3. And in this position, we may notice that still white has a pawn majority on the king side. Black still has these weaknesses, this positional drawback, double pawns on the queen side. But this position is not necessarily that clear, because white also has some drawbacks in his position, especially for the middle game stage, because light squares are weakened. So I would say that both sides have some chances here, but I would still prefer white in this situation. Now let's get back to the most popular reply to the exchanged variation. It is f6 move. So another option is just to protect e5 pawn with the f6 move, which is pretty solid, because what can be more solid than the protection of the pawn? And exactly here, white tries to exchange queens and create this beneficial situation after the change of the pawn structure. So d4 is played here immediately, and after e takes d4, knight captures on d4. Queen takes d4 is also possible, but I think that knight takes d4 is a bit more flexible, because white also keeps a possibility to play the middle game if black decides to keep queens on the board. It is also not so pleasant for black in many cases. So the normal flow here is just to play c5, in fact, just to attack a very strong centralized knight, then exchange queens and try to build the correct setup against white's majority, using the power of bishops as well. After c5, white normally goes away to either b3 or e2. Let's start with the knight to b3 move. So on b3, it's a bit passive, because it is limited with pawns of black, but this c5 itself may be a target a bit later. Here, after queen captures queen, rook captures queen, and bishop to g4, well, it's one of the possibilities. Sometimes black just develops the bishop directly to d7 without playing to g4. Sometimes the bishop goes to e6. Well, the idea behind bishop to g4 is that after f3 and bishop back to more interesting position on e6, diagonal a7, g1 is weakened, so black may think of playing something like c4 later on, bring the bishop to c5 with some threads along that diagonal. So here white has several options. One of them is just to play bishop f4, immediately attacking c7 pawn. By the way, if black puts the bishop on d7, it is not necessarily that dangerous, because black may castle protecting that pawn. With the bishop on e6, as you can see, it's not so easy to protect c7. Well, of course you may play something like rook to c8, but it's not what you usually want to do. Rook will be very passive on c8, and the king will probably stay in the center, which is, well, just not very harmonious. So here, black may try c4. And after knight goes to d4, it's possible to castle because the knight is pinned now. You can see the rook is hanging on d1, so knight takes e6 will just lose the game after rook takes d1. So here white continues with the knight to c3 move, simply developing the piece and protecting the rook, so bishop is hanging again. And if black plays aggressive bishop to c5 move, white protects the knight with the knight e2 move. So white's position is rather flexible here. After something like knight to e7, so knight is pinned, so bishop is not hanging, that's the point here. But white plays something like bishop e3, and very soon this bishop will be hanging, probably what is already intending to take it, because it will be an exchange of the bishop. And black will no longer have pair of bishops. Remember, it is one of the most important things here, the main compensation for doubled pawns. So black may want to go away with the bishop to f7. And here white plays this knight to f5. Also interesting moment, because it literally forces black to exchange dark squared bishop, because g7 is hanging, bishop is hanging itself. And this means after something like bishop takes e3 and knight takes e3, black no longer has pair of bishops, and hence white's chances are increasing here. But I don't want to say that white has a serious advantage already. I would just say that this position is more pleasant for white to play. But again, everything depends on your skills in the endgame stage. So if you're a good endgame player, you may play this position with both colors having equal chances to outplay your opponent. Let's get back a bit and see what happens if white plays knight to c3, another possibility for white to play in addition to bishop f4. So in this situation, white develops the minor piece, and since black has already played c5, it has to be very careful about d5 square, one of the typical squares where the knight eventually lands, exerting some pressure on, say, c7 or potentially even b6, because black may want to push another c pawn at some point. So after knight to c3, black may want to play bishop to d6, preventing bishop f4 first of all, and closing the d file, which means castling is ready. So here, white may play bishop e3, attacking the pawn. If pawn moves, then knight gets to a very active position in the center, so black normally tries to protect it with another pawn. And white has some interesting possibilities here. One of the typical ideas here is to play a4 with a simple point. So white wants to play a5, where after black's pawn structure on the queen side will be under serious pressure. So bishop on d6 is protected by pawn c7, as you can see. And if we play a5, we almost every time create a threat of taking on b6, and then if pawn takes, bishop is hanging. So in many cases, if the exchange of a pawn to the b pawn forces black to recapture with a piece, well, it's just a positional disaster because all the pawns will be quite weak. That's the point behind a4. Also pay attention that something like a5 may not be so good for black, also because of knight to b5 move, just attacking the bishop. And it doesn't feel like black has anything better than just protecting it, but then the pawns will be weak again after this exchange on d6. So here, after a4, black has to be very careful. If black simply castles, lone protecting the bishop, white may continue the attack with the a5, and after king to b7, we can see that there is a problem with the coordination. So rook is still not protected, bishop is quite vulnerable, so white has very interesting possibility of just playing e5. Bishop cannot capture, obviously, because the rook is hanging, so f takes e5 is more or less forced, where after a takes b6 creates some problems to the king. In case king takes on b6, there is just a direct attack after something like knight a4 or bishop takes c5 later on. If pawn captures on b6, then the bishop is no longer so safe, and white may continue with the knight to e4. This is also quite hard for black to survive it because there are different ideas, including the sacrifice on c5. a6 is always hanging, so if the king protects the bishop, there is rook takes a6. So to know more about this direction, I would strongly recommend you to look at some games of Bobby Fischer. So he managed to crush several opponents in a very good style here. So let's have a look at the other option that black has against a4. Let's get back to that position. Okay. So in this situation, black may try king to f7 move, protecting the bishop. So what's the point behind this move? The idea is to react to a5 with c4, counterattacking the knight, because, you know, immediate b5 will be always like a mistake because c5 will drop. But when the pawn is already on c4, it's possible to play b5 and keep this position on the queen side pretty closed. So knight goes to d4, attacking the bishop, and now black may play b5. So that's the thing. In this case, if black is losing the light square bishop, I mean, it is exchanged and black no longer has pair of bishops, it's okay because black managed to bring his pawns on the queen side to pretty active positions. So there may be some counterplay based on that pawn. So it's fine. I mean, this position should be pretty balanced, but once again, everything depends on your endgame skills. Let's get back now to the moment where the knight on d4 was attacked and see what else white can do in addition to knight to b3. So in this situation, it's also possible to move the knight to e2, and I find it a bit more flexible move because from there, knight also controls f4 and may support the play based on the weakness of d5 square. After queen takes d1, rook takes d1. Let's say black continues with bishop to d7, directly preparing castling long. White plays knight to c3, black castles, and white develops the bishop on e3. So now the point is that white quickly doubles the rook on the d file. Black has to be very careful. Another idea is to use f4 square with the bishop. For example, whenever the bishop goes to d6, it's possible to play bishop f4, kind of offering the exchange of bishops, and it's good for white if this exchange happens. If bishop goes away, there is knight to d5 move. Another idea may be knight f4 and knight d5 at some point. So let's say black plays rook to e8. Pretty typical thing, by the way, to enable the move of the bishop, because otherwise black is losing the fight for the d file. Rook goes to d2, bishop goes to c6, attacking e4. Rook goes to d1, using the fact that black cannot take e4 twice because of the checkmate on d8. So black may want to start with the b6, and after that, white protects the pawn on e4 with the pawn. Black continues the development of the kingside pieces. Knight goes to e7, white's knight goes to f4, and knight goes to g6. So again, this position is very interesting. It may teach you a lot in the sense of endgame play, and I would recommend you to try it with both colors. So it's pretty balanced. White still has the majority and some chances to exploit that majority on the king side. Black still has this drawback, but pair of bishops is potentially a good thing. And black actually built up very solid setup here to stop the immediate pawn storm of white's pawns on the king side. So the next play will be connected to maintaining the advantages and all the tries of creating some new weaknesses in the opponent's camp. Black may want to bring the bishop to d6 at some point. Maybe the knight will stay on e5, actually waiting for white's f4 move so that e4 will be slightly vulnerable after that. Sometimes black develops the bishop to g7 after playing g6. White wants to occupy d5 square and exert some pressure on c7 potentially. Sometimes this knight goes to h5 to prevent the development of the bishop f8. So very interesting, rich and complicated play follows. I hope you will enjoy it in your practice. That's basically it for the exchanged variation, but in the next video we're going to look at some common traps there.